Welcome to episode 15 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Today, we have a special guest with us. We actually have one of my long-term mentors that I met initially in undergrad, Dr. Ciaran Fairman, currently is an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. I have known Ciaran for a long time. Like I said, I initially met Ciaran when he was a PhD student at the Ohio State University. And he has since been kind of all around the globe and done a lot of cool stuff in the area specifically of exercise oncology. Ciaran's an overall really cool dude. I don't want to make his head too big, given too many compliments here to start us off, but he's a really passionate guy. I really just enjoy talking to him, not only about his specific research interests, as I mentioned, about how can we leverage exercise and nutrition interventions in specifically patients with cancer, but also just talking to Ciaran about his experience transitioning from he kind of started more so in kind of the S&C and sports nutrition realm to where he is now more in clinical research at a big time R1 university and kind of navigating the scientific landscape to where he is now and what we can learn from that and just the general research process. So Ciaran, thank you for joining us today.
Appreciate it, lads. Happy to be here. Am I actually a special guest, or do you say special guest for everyone? Don't say it if you don't mean it.
You're our third guest.
Third guest? I mean, I'm third special. Cool. Happy to be here.
Cool. Yeah, Ciaran. So I think just the place to start is just kind of, giving the old audience a little bit of an intro on yourself. I know I gave you a little bit of a preamble there, where you started your education and kind of how you got to where you are now, just the old standard intro.
Yeah, so, I mean, my background is kind of varied. I never really had, much like many of us, I never really had an interest in research to begin with. I came over from Ireland initially to play soccer and was convinced going to a D2 school that was going to somehow turn pro. Quickly realized that was not going to be an option. So I decided to get involved in more the academic world. And I had this amazing professor who was heavy on ex-phys, who would come out and watch you play soccer and talk to me about or quiz me on why we were warming up and what was happening to the body in terms of enzymes, the pH levels and all that stuff. And at the time I was taking American history, French and geography. I was like, this college stuff was not for me. And it was the first class that I took that I was like, I could do this. Like I fell in love with it. And that kind of combining ex-phys with sports for a long time was my passion. It still is to be fair, but that kind of started me involved in the research game. And for a long time, I thought I was kind of going to go sports nutrition and S&C, and went to do my master's at Georgia Southern, where I worked in a human performance lab under Chrissy Kendall. We did a lot of nutrition and body comp type research, but my own mother got breast cancer when I was in my sophomore year of college. And much like the field has kind of been started, when you listen to everything that people are experiencing with chemo and radiation, hormonal therapy, and the changes that happen both physically and mentally to the body, the negative effects of cancer treatment kind of mirror what you would expect of the positive effects of exercise. So a lot of people kind of much smarter than me a long time ago put those two together and started researching it. And that kind of started the transition for me to get more interested in the clinical world. To be honest, for a couple of reasons. The first one was I don't know if it would have had a good enough impact or a big enough impact on the sports science world. There's a lot of massive people in that field that are doing some really quality work, and I don't think I would have been able to contribute something significant or unique enough to warrant me being in there. And then secondly, the exercise oncology field is so new. I mean, it's the first study was published in the late 80s, and they are in desperate need of people with an understanding of principles of training and different nutritional strategies to optimize outcomes in that field, because a lot of it came from early work in oncologists or nurses or people who are more clinically trained. So that's really where I saw the gap for me, was an area that I'm super passionate about, and also being able to bring my background and training into that field. So that's kind of where I was at Ohio State, where I really started to focus in on that and bring a lot of those principles of training into the field of exercise oncology.
Just to jump in here quick, I think, and this is one of the many reasons we wanted to have you on is, it's really cool how you have and you've collaborated with people like Dr. Eric Holmes, our advisor, Dr. Mike Zordos, and you've been kind of taking your expertise in strength and conditioning and applying it to these clinical populations, which was is just super cool, right? And Dr. Fairman wanted me to get it on the record that if he didn't guest lecture in one of my undergraduate courses for exercise science, when I was doing my degree at Ohio State, there would be no data-driven strength. So basically, I had just changed my major to exercise science. Similar to you, Dr. Fairman, I was fine at school. I was doing well, but I was like, I just don't really like this. So I was like, okay, I know I like exercise science, but I don't really know what to do after this, right? Physical therapy, that seems like the right thing to do. So that was kind of my plan. You came in, you talked about exercise oncology, you brought a ton of passion to it. And I remember walking back to my dorm that day, I was like, this research stuff, this is really, really cool. And that's how I learned about Dr. Brian Folk's lab. And then I started volunteering there, and that's where I met Zach. And then we realized we both knew what RPE meant. And then, the rest is history. So just wanted to get that on air and provide a little bit of context for the listener of, Dr. Fairman's, your expertise. You have a very wide ranging expertise, but it's really cool how you've applied some of the stuff that we talk about when we're just thinking about the healthy young guy that's trying to get an extra 10 kilos on their back squat, and how some of this stuff may be relevant for people outside of, that specific population.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations that immediately comes in my mind is I still remember one of the days I sat down at Ciaran's desk, and I had been reading around on the internet, and I came to the conclusion that I knew how to fix exercise oncology. I had what they were missing, and it was just the very simple fact that if we had every cancer patient squatting, benching, and deadlifting in a calorie surplus, we had it solved. I just didn't understand what was so complicated about that equation. But then Ciaran, being the kind mentor that he is, and an understanding person, politely but firmly told me I was a huge idiot, and progressively strayed me away from the as simplistic of a thought process that I had at that time to hopefully less so now, although that is debatable. But kind of one of the things, Ciaran, that I think is a really interesting perspective that you can have, obviously in kind of the practical realm where we're often talking about, applying research and trying to help people, like Josh said, add another 5-10 kilos on their squat. As you've kind of navigated the entire resistance training research landscape, going from, like you said, super performance-driven research in both sports nutrition and exercise science, to kind of where you are now, where we're looking to leverage some of those principles from S&C and sports nutrition to ultimately foster the best outcomes in the populations we're working with now. What do you think is kind of the biggest thing you've learned, if you had to boil it down to that, and kind of a one big thing if you had to point to there? Big question, I know.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I've learned is it depends. The interesting thing for my career, it mirrors you, Zach, in a lot of ways, where I came in heavy physiology, heavy bro, everyone needs to squat, bench, deadlift. And I went into the behavioral lab and started to learn more about the psychology of training. And even now, I kind of went to Edith County University, did my postdoc there, where we looked at all different types of cancers during and after cancer treatment, even towards metastatic patients at the end of life. And have now come to my Department of Exercise Science is housed in the School of Public Health, and they work with a lot of health disparities down here. And the really niche area is we need to get people stronger, to be more resilient, to improve health-related quality of life, reduce the risk of falls and fractures, so on and so forth. The big picture is some people can't afford to eat to actually complement their training strategy. Some people don't have access to a gym or to equipment. And so I consistently find myself battling with how important those super fine details are, because I can get really passionate about it. And also the big picture and the scalability. We talk about that, the trial we've got going on right now. I'm challenged a lot here by folks who have a lot of experience in the space of scalability. It can't just be you're the best trainer. It can't be, well, I could fix everyone, because there's millions of people with cancer who need help. And so if we're going to talk about, well, my intervention is the best, the effect you see in a lab is a different effect than you would expect to see at a scaled level. So how can you develop your intervention that has scalability, that can, instead of working with 20 people in Florida or South Carolina, we can train trainers to then go out into the world and train folks? Because especially when you get to the point where you're working with older adults, individuals with cancer who have the financial toxicity of cancer treatments. There's some stuff going on around on Twitter right now where 2 rounds of chemo is costing up to 50 grand. I mean, if you're a low income third shift worker and you've got 3 kids and you're on food stamps, you don't give a rat's backside about whether or not you can do auto regulation or not. It's, can you keep food on the table? And also, personal preference has a huge factor in this. So when we were working with metastatic patients towards the end of life, there's a few big randomized controlled trials right now looking at the impact of exercise participation and overall survival. Now, if those results come back and say, if you participate in resistance training, we may be able to improve survival by a couple of months. We have to be very careful about the message that sends. Because if you've got someone who's diagnosed with terminal cancer and a few months left to live, and we sit across from the table and go, sorry, mate, have you tried squatting? It's, when we talk about exercise medicine, we have to be very careful of understanding the role that we play in the bigger context of those people's lives. If someone comes to me and says, I've got extreme muscle wasting because I've got a terminal diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, what should I do? You might want to train a bit. We don't really know how much that's going to be benefit, but if you're going to want to go and live by the lake and eat pizza and drink beer because you've got 3 months left to live, I'm not going to stop you. You know what I mean? I'm going to celebrate that. So I think that that's a long answer to say my what I've learned the most is to kind of understand the granularity of training, but then be able to step back on the 40-foot view and kind of put that into context of someone's life.
Yeah, I think that kind of spurs two thoughts for me. I think understanding that granularity can probably help you take a step back and learn how to make that intervention scalable, like you said. We can kind of pick out the things that are probably the most important, the things that are the least important. But at the same time, having that bigger picture perspective as you kind of have shifted the populations that you work with just gets you to understand that there's just so many more things that kind of come into this equation than just the couple of numbers that we have written on the sheet as far as the training program goes. So yeah, that's super interesting.
Honestly, like if you talk to me, you would think I was bipolar, because one day I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like people aren't active. We just need to get people active. And then I'll get equally as passionate the next day. Go, no, it matters. They have to strength train. It has to be a high enough load with a frequency enough of impact, all that stuff. I'm a mess.
Something Zach and I often talk about, and we do not claim to have a fraction of the experience with these types of populations like you do. But the little experience we did have while helping with research at Ohio State in Dr. Folk's lab and working with, a clinical population as opposed to young, healthy individuals, it really, I've found that experience to be helpful when working with young, healthy individuals, because you understand that everybody's human in front of you, right? And I remember something that always stuck with me. You were on the Sigma Nutrition podcast in 2016, 2017, whatever it was. And you were just talking about kind of a similar theme you just mentioned of the most potent factor is going from sedentary to not sedentary. And if that's snowboarding for someone, because that's what they like to do, then they should probably snowboard. I remember you specifically said snowboarding. So yeah, I just think that, normal listeners of our podcast may not have kind of that clinical lens, but I think that they're not mutually exclusive and they can complement each other. And, it's humans, and we often get bogged down in, is RP7 or RP8 better? But at the end of the day, the fact that you're doing one set of resistance training or, doing your favorite hobby that's mildly active is the most potent factor to get you off the ground. So, yeah.
So the next question I had, go ahead, Ciaran, go ahead.
Well, just to echo that, I think it's hard when you talk about my transition from kind of sports science into the clinical world. that was probably one of the hardest things for me to let go of my own ego in a lot of ways, because I had built a lot of my education around these things are important.
Mm.
And even the collaboration with Zordos and Helms was looking at autoregulation in the context of cancer. And I still think it has value, but holding on to those principles and ideas as tightly as I used to, I wouldn't be able to progress in my career and have impact if I was so locked down on those elements. And I say that to kind of support you in the sense of it's a difficult transition to make, to kind of make peace with, you know what, they might not be as important as we think in certain contexts.
Right. Yeah. I guess the next place my mind went was, so we kind of just discussed how your experience in, more sports science and sports nutrition research has kind of shaped your experience now. Knowing what you know now, how would you reflect back on sports science research? And is there anything that sticks out in your mind to improve the quality of work that we can do in these kind of more trained populations in which we are looking to add 5-10 kilos on people's lifts? Like what perspective that you have now with kind of the more clinical research would you look back and apply that lens to kind of the more applied stuff?
I think it's hard for me to say kind of one specific thing. For me, as we've moved into clinical populations, a lot of what we've now been challenged with in terms of people who review our work and the standard that we are held to is matched along clinical trials. So when we're starting to do our work now in the field of oncology, people are evaluating our work as if it should have the rigor of a clinical trial for pharmacology. And so with that comes a very specified route from biological plausibility all the way through to confirmatory testing. And we're consistently challenged on how is your research fitting along in that pipeline? So we can't jump into, I'm going to do an RCT of N of 400. We have to be able to test first, is there a signal that's worth looking at? Is there something that gives us actually a hypothesis to test? Then we have to test the feasibility, much like we'll talk about the cluster sets in a while, but I could have a great idea and convince myself that it's a really cool idea, but without testing the feasibility and knocking the kinks out of it, it's too early in development to go to a comparative efficacy trial and compare it to standard resistance training or another, arm. And then you get to the point where you've kind of done the feasibility pilot testing and you kind of have these check marks of a priori, meaning you've planned these before you run the trial. These are our markers of success. And if we can reach these, we'll kind of define our trial as successful, and that will give us the green light to go on through the spectrum. Now, that's a very difficult line of inquiry to replicate in elite athletes. Mike Ormsby had something a while ago where he was getting grief from reviewers because his sample size from the Ironman was too low. Like, how many elite Ironmen are there that are willing to give up their time on race day to participate in research? And so I see the value in the line of inquiry and trying to develop that level of rigor in your trials to ensure there's replicability and ensure that the evidence is high enough quality. But there also has to be that caveat in accepting that there are limitations to sports science. Inherently, one of those is working with smaller sample size. So we have to find a way to work within that context. I'm sure as each of you start to take statistics classes, if you take stats classes outside of a department of exercise science, they laugh at us. They're like, what, sample size of 50 to 100? No chance. Don't believe it. Because they're working in samples of thousands.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of one of the things that I've consistently tried to learn as I'm moving forward. And I think there's elements of that could be really valuable to sports science. Now, how that translates into what you could do to improve it is a completely different conversation,
Mm-hmm. Josh, got anything?
No, I did have, well, yes, I do, but I have a question that is kind of hypothetical, and I'm curious your thoughts on it, because you mentioned, there's kind of two sides of you, right? The side of you that's all about like just exercise adoption or physical activity adoption. Then there's the other side of you that is interested in the minutia. So let's say we lived in a perfect world and you controlled it and you could make it perfect for whatever you see, whatever you think is best. would you take some of the researchers or the brain power that is looking at the minutia and apply that to a more general population, boots on the ground, exercise adoption, more that kind of route? I'm curious your thoughts there. If it were totally up to you.
Yeah, that's pretty. You essentially define my career. That's what I try to do. I try to sprinkle in elements of my training into kind of these bigger physical activity trials. I used to, my mentor, Dr. Brian Foe, who is phenomenal. We used to talk a lot about many of his interventions are rooted around the idea of self-efficacy and affective response to exercise. And so he would kind of specifically dose his interventions around kind of a pleasure response and making sure people are for the most part enjoying it, because we know that enjoyment and positive affect is tied to independent adoption and maintenance of activity. I would challenge him and go, well, just because, if we start someone off at a specific load or intensity or whatever you want to define it at the start of an intervention, we don't know. There's also a positive affective response from being challenged. If you're within the realm of self-efficacy, there's going to be a window of that higher ceiling where you're challenged, but you kind of think you can do it and you can strive for it. And then there's spilled over the top where the challenge is too far beyond your level of self-efficacy. And I would be a proponent of trying to get to that ceiling as close as we can and continuously progress folks. And there's other elements, like a lot of our work has looked at the principles of training in the field of exercise oncology. So we evaluate all the resistance training literature in exercise oncology back in 2017 or 2018 and looked at how well people defined, included, and reported principles of training, specifically overload and progression. And I'm going to mess up the percentages, but I think overload was something around 74% of studies and progression was something around 67. So you've got over a third of studies who aren't including any sort of overload for an initial loading. And then you've got a quarter of studies that are over a third of studies that aren't having any sort of progression. And so you're kind of diluting the ultimate dose of training, what you could get, because we know if John or Tyreek likes that 100-pound leg press and we don't have any kind of touch points with him, he's going to come in and continuously do the 100-pound leg press. And so I've tried to implement principles of training and try to improve our field more broadly that way. And just kind of, again, they're not, I'd say this because when you say expertise, I laugh because I'm just borrowing principles from sports science and S&C and bringing them into exercise oncology, and everyone's like, oh my God, I'm just stealing a bunch of people's ideas and bringing them into a new field. But I think it's well received in the context of oncology because a lot of people don't have the resistance training background,
Definitely. Yeah, that kind of brings me to like kind of our first kind of discussion of your work. When we're thinking about the principles of training that I think are probably the most important in this population would be probably progression and overload. And when we kind of just talk about everything, I think that's probably the most important. But so even considering the fact that you're saying that, 3/4 to 2/3 of the study still include that, you wrote a blog post that's really thought-provoking on, we're putting so much effort into trying to increase these adaptations in these populations because we think they have merit. Like you said, increase muscle mass, increase strength in these populations, decrease fall risk, increase quality of life, all that good stuff. You wrote a pretty thought-provoking blog of, if you look at like some of the meta-analyses on this topic, there does seem to be like a positive effect in terms of increasing muscle mass. But when you really boil that down to like an absolute change in muscle mass, it's really, really small. And it actually might be within the measurement area of the tools that we use to actually measure the muscle mass. So we don't totally know if we're actually causing adaptation. Kind of want to just kick that topic off. Like, can we reliably increase muscle mass in patients undergoing curative care? Doesn't matter. How do we frame that discussion? Is it a lost cause? Should we stop resistance training? Is maintenance important? All that good stuff.
What do you want me to do? Answer all 17 at once?
I'm just giving you the blog.
No, do you know what? Funny, I laughed at when you said that blog because that blog was done with the best intentions. I was like, "This is it. I'm a blogger now. I'm gonna do this weekly," and that was the one and only blog.
That was in April 2020. April 2020 was the published date on that blog.
Okay, so there's a few things there. The first thing, as you said, if you look at a lot of the meta-analyses in this space, we see, first of all, we see a blunted response to training. So a lot of the metas are going to give you, on average, an increase in anywhere from 0.5 to 0.7 kilograms in lean mass with anywhere from 3 to 6 months of resistance training in cancer. Now, if you look at some of the relative the meta-analyses in apparently healthy older adults, you can expect anywhere from 1 to 1.3 or 4 kilograms. So off the bat, there's something going on that's a blunted response. Now, having come from the sports science world and understanding and appreciating how much rigor is required in the assessment of body composition, particularly when you think about hydration status, which can vary dramatically in individuals with cancer who are going through treatment, whether it's edema or their own hydration status from various treatments or their own appetite, it can change. And I'll also go on the record. I think a great insight into this area is Cody Hahn and a few others wrote a really fantastic paper on what are we measuring in terms of muscle. And those guys, the likes of him and Mike Roberts, are monsters in this space. I'm just the dude that's jumping on the coattails and borrowing stuff, pretending like I know what I'm talking about. So what I kind of borrowed from that field was, if you look at a 0.5 change and you assume that, say the DEXA has anywhere from 0.7 to 1 kilogram error, well, unless it's outside of that error, we can't conclusively say that change was a result of the intervention rather than spontaneous error. The second thing is, if you look at a lot of the meta-analyses, the majority of work or the majority of results are being pulled up. The average is being pulled up by 1 or 2 studies that have a quote unquote higher change. So there's a couple of studies that have 1.2 change in lean mass across an intervention. Those studies have predominantly been in folks who are either post-treatment or in really low burdensome treatment. So why this is important is low muscle mass at diagnosis is associated with increase in treatment toxicities, particularly from chemotherapy. It's thought to be related to surface area and metabolism of the treatments, but it's fairly consistent that low muscle mass in a variety of different cancers is associated with increase in treatment-related toxicity. So you've got nausea, neutropenia, all these kind of immunosuppression, which basically, if you think about chemotherapy is not you just get one infusion and you're good. The dose and frequency of chemo can change based on the type of cancer and the stage of treatment. But if you take breast cancer, for example, they'll have chemo on day 1, and then chemo is a toxic agent, or chemo agents are toxic when they're combined. So your body needs time to recover from them. So you'll take 2 or 3 weeks off, come back and get another infusion, take 2 or 3 weeks off, come back. When we talk about treatment toxicities, a cold can turn into pneumonia. And you can be so sick from the treatments that you'll have to delay treatment, or you'll have to reduce the dose of treatment. So you're not getting the same, quote unquote, as efficacious of a dose as you would otherwise. And so that's one of the reasons why low muscle mass is really important. Secondly, the loss of muscle mass that's exacerbated by treatment can increase the risk of mortality, particularly in some of these advanced cancers or more aggressive cancers, like pancreatic, like GI cancers, or head and neck, for example. Head and neck is brutal, where you can get chemo once a week, radiation every day for like 6 weeks. You're losing 20, 30 kilograms in 6 weeks. And so those scenarios are on the extreme end of why it's really important to target muscle. And also those extreme scenarios, a lot of us are writing narrative reviews of here's all these targets for exercise and nutrition. We can target inflammation. We can target catabolism. We can target XYZ. We're actually finishing up a paper right now where we're asking the question: are these potential targets or are they barriers to? So we could target inflammation, but can you do the dose of exercise and the frequency of exercise and the duration of exercise required to reduce inflammation to a degree that would have a clinical benefit? We don't know, because we know the tolerability of exercise in these folks is terrible at times. Or if you've had head and neck cancer and you've had half your jaw removed and you've got radiation to the throat and systemic chemo flushed throughout your body, and you're consuming 800 calories a day through enteral nutrition, through a feeding tube, do you have the requisite energy to support a training load and to recover from that training load that would actually warrant any improvements? And so there's a lot of really complicated challenges to trying to do this, as opposed to exercise can increase muscle mass. And it's funny, I talk about this a lot of times when people think about you work in exercise and cancer, it seems like a really niche, small area. A lot of us think of breast, prostate, colon, maybe lung, but you open it up to that, to the breadth of different tumor types that exist and different stages and different types of treatments. That's part of the thing that fascinates me the most about it, but it also precludes us from making these universal statements of what exercise can and can't do. All of that is to say, I do think there's an avenue for preservation. So we just submitted a meta-analysis to Sports Med, where we looked at all of the resistance training trials trying to improve muscle mass in cancer during or after treatment compared to those who don't. So again, we saw a blunted response where you're looking on average, it was like 0.5 kilogram increase. Where you start to see the clinical benefit is what happens to the usual care group or the people who don't train. So it may not be as important to increase mass. Rather, is it important to preserve mass because we know what would happen otherwise? And I think if you take that context, we know that strength is pretty sensitive to change, particularly in untrained folks. So again, step back 44. People could have peripheral neuropathy. They could have cardiotoxicity. Muscle mass is only one of their concerns. They have excess body fat. So can we maintain muscle mass, increase strength and physical function, maybe try and improve gait speed, and then try and improve all the other comorbidities and try to improve overall quality of life, as opposed to muscle mass is the only thing that matters, you know?
I think just to kind of echo how you wrap that up is, like, we think of resistance training, we think increases in muscle size. We think resistance training, we think increase in leg press 1 rep max, but it's so much more than that, right? And that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like you're kind of saying that, we shouldn't get too narrow of a focus in our resistance training interventions, because, like, for maybe a certain individual, increasing quality of life is the most important thing to focus on. Arguably, maybe that's the case for anybody. So I'm curious how you kind of, conceptualize that, again, going from S&C, healthy populations to clinical populations, is what factors, and you can even incorporate, like, working with these patients through some of the trials you've been involved in. It's like, what do you think, just even if it's subjective, like, what do you think is the most important thing that resistance training can do for these types of patients?
You said something there that I want to piggyback on, where you were challenged with, like, the so what of it all. That was one of the biggest things for me coming into this field, where, and Zach, you remember Zordos had the same insight, where we talk about this training intervention versus this could increase leg press by 40 kilograms. And in our field, in like sports science, and people who are young and fit, and we identify, we're like, that's amazing. I can get stronger. And no one has ever questioned the so what of that, because to us, that's the ultimate goal. Like, yeah, get stronger.
Yeah.
As soon as you say that to an oncologist, they don't care. They're like, okay, tell me why doing this program versus this program, having a 40 kilogram increase, what does that mean? What's the clinically meaningful benefit of it? And the truth is, we don't know. It may give you more of a buffer against eventual decline. So we know that low strength and low gait speed is associated with falls and fractures and lack of independence. So maybe if we give you a bigger strength reserve, you have a longer fall to go. To answer your question about what do I think, this is one of the biggest changes in my career, is I'm starting to see that what I think is irrelevant. So a lot of what we're doing now is getting patient advisory groups and actually talking to people who are experiencing this. And instead of us saying, you should increase muscle, we get people together and say, what are you being challenged with? What is important to you? And here are elements that resistance training can improve. And again, it comes down to kind of value expectations of translating what we understand strength to do to what an individual can relate to. So your shoulder press strength is irrelevant, but can we increase your mobility and strength to where you can pick up your kids or throw them over your shoulder or whatever? Your gait speed is irrelevant, but it may prevent or enable you to walk around your neighborhood more often. Your leg press or sit to stand is irrelevant, but you can get in and out of the car, you can get up and down the stairs, all these other things that, again, when we talk about quality of life, it's health related. All these elements are tied to your inherent ability to function about your daily life.
Interesting. Trying to think. I just had lost my thought. What was it? Come on, Josh, save me. I'm going to bring it back here in 3 seconds. I just got to remember what I was going to say.
No, I think you.
I remember. Okay, so I'm not disagreeing with what you said at all. I'm just bringing it back. Let's say we did want to focus on muscle. So you published a paper about kind of the dose of exercise and how that's related to what we are writing down in the protocol of a study versus what is actually reported. So one of the things you just talked about there a ton was the main barrier we have with this population is actually the implementation and the sustainability and the tolerance of exercise. So, we have these training studies where we can write this perfect protocol from somebody that has an SSC background. And we think it's all shiny and new and it's going to have all these cool effects. But the reality is, especially once you've been a part of research with these populations and you understand how difficult it is to actually get them to adhere and tolerate the exercise that we actually want to give in the protocol, the intended dose versus the actual dose is considerably different. And so if we do kind of put our practical trained population hats on, we know that, training volume or kind of training dose seems to be related to the adaptations that we care about. So I think this is actually going to tie the cluster set stuff together nicely, because is the real goal to find a configuration of training that allows people to tolerate an effective dose so that we can increase these outcomes that we think to be related to health, related to quality of life.
Yeah. And I think, again, I don't know if that configuration of training is going to be universal.
For sure.
I think that paper came from, and this kind of ties into a lot of our conversations of just the replicability of research, where I was reading a lot of these earlier papers and they were nice, polished, randomized controlled trials. We did 3 sets of 10 of whatever exercises for 6 months. And then I started to work with humans and started to go, there's no way, especially when you look at older adults who, if you've been living in your body for 50, 60, 70 years, it's like having a 95 Honda Accord. Like it's beat to bits, They're going to have bum knees and bum shoulders and all these aches and cracks that impact their ability to tolerate exercise. And so that paper came about much, again, pulling sports science principles in. I was like, it's no good to anyone for us to say, we plan 3 sets of 10 for 12 weeks or 6 months. I want to know what they actually did. So we need to find a way to develop metrics to actually quantify that. Now, the metrics that we proposed, I'd say they're fairly rudimentary. We just used volume load and compared what we said they were going to do to what they actually did. I think there's a lot of people doing some interesting work that have improved them since, but it was more just the concept in general. Let's start talking about what they actually did and forget about what we prescribed. To your point, Zach, it's almost irrelevant what we prescribe, you know, because even when you talk about tolerability is all relevant to what you said initially. If you don't have a good background, you could propose some off the wall stuff, and they're not going to tolerate it because you plan 16 sets of 10 every day.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of nuances to that type of method in terms of reporting, but I think it can move the field forward a little bit to, again, try and find doses and strategies of training that can increase or improve our outcomes.
Yeah. So just to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page, and then we can kind of dive into chatting about a recent paper that you were on. We'll link the paper in the description of this episode, but Basically, it was just kind of like and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Fairman, but kind of an opinion piece or just like a, hey, this is something worth looking into, specifically looking at implementing cluster sets in clinical populations. And again, just so that the listeners on the same page here, this kind of encompasses multiple different strategies. So traditional cluster set would be, okay, I'm doing a set of 8. I'm going to take a 30-second break after rep 4 and then finish the set. There's also like inter-repetition rest. So I do a rep, I rest 10 seconds, I do another rep, and I complete the set. There's also like rest pause. So you do a proper set, you rest a little bit, you do some more reps. So point being is we're basically reducing the fatigue within the set. And this paper just does an excellent job of outlining potential use cases for this set structure in clinical populations. So, when we typically talk about cluster sets or different rest redistribution strategies, we're talking about reducing that fatigue within the set because it kind of leads to some interesting downstream possibilities. So instead of doing, 2 sets of 10 to failure, what if we did those sets of 6 with that load, and maybe we can do more than 20 total reps with that load because again, we have those downstream benefits. So, Dr. Fairman, I'll just kind of kick it over to you, and you can kind of give us a broad overview of, what the thought process was for that paper and kind of where your head's at with the topic of cluster sets and when that may be applicable with some of these populations.
Yeah, if you call me Dr. Fairman again one more time, I'm going to hang up the phone. Yeah, to be honest with you, man, like this to me, this project that I'll talk about is probably one of my proudest to date because I've worked very hard to try and develop a program of research that is replicable and transparent in nature. And that has come with a lot of challenges throughout my career. So me as a researcher, I was always 90 miles an hour, throw anything out the door. And I was kind of a volume guy of like, I need all the publications, I need all the studies, blah, blah, blah. And that caught up with me in the middle of my PhD where I published a systematic review and it was sloppy. There was a lot of stuff that made it to the final product and the final publication where it just wasn't tight. We missed certain studies, we included wrong studies, and our proportions of what we were talking about was off, and we got a letter to the editor. Now, at the time of my career, I was 26, halfway through my PhD, was kind of on a decent trajectory. And this hit me like a ton of bricks because it was the leaders in the field of exercise oncology saying, hey, this dude that just put out this research, it's sloppy. We don't agree with it because it's sloppy. And it was a huge wake up call to me in I've moved beyond caring about numbers and moved exclusively to quality. And I want to do impactful work and I want to make sure that's respected by my peers. And that letter and that process since has really forced me or made me focus on what's important there. So this is the culmination of that. So as you said, cluster sets came from Olympic lifting, came from athletic populations where the idea is to mitigate fatigue with repetitions, particularly in power exercises, to try and maintain the quality of training. I have a fantastic friend in Australia, Ciaran McIntyre, who's doing some really interesting work on mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a tumor or a type of cancer that affects the lining of the lungs. And so she's doing a bit of resistance training, and we were kind of chatting in a hallway one day, and she was talking a lot about how these folks are impacted a lot by dyspnea or shortness of breath and fatigue. And so what happens in these kind of untrained clinical populations who have these barriers to training, how people will accommodate that is that they will reduce the load to a point where they can actually get through a set of 10. So you have a lot of dyspnea, shortness of breath, and you've got a lot of fatigue. You can't do a set of 10 overhead press with 5-pound dumbbells. So we'll just do, body weight to get you through the exercise. The challenge inherently with that is you end up reducing the load to such a low level that you're not really going to see any positive adaptations in terms of the musculoskeletal system. So that was kind of where the premise came from, was what if we implemented cluster sets and introduced rest between every few repetitions, could we alleviate some of that fatigue? Could we help them get their breath back and mitigate some of those factors, and either allow them to tolerate a similar load with reduced perception of fatigue or shortness of breath, or allow them to handle a higher load with similar perceptions of fatigue and dyspnea? And so again, this comes back to what we were talking about before. We are nowhere close to testing this compared to a traditional training program, because cluster sets have never been done in this population. So what we're trialing now, coming up in the fall, is a feasibility trial. So we have all these elements of feasibility that we have markers to hit, and it's kind of a few step process. Firstly, we have community representatives who have, in our population, we're going to go with non-small cell lung cancer. So we're getting folks who had a diagnosis of non-small lung cancer, and we're going to test their protocol on them. So based on how that works out, that it's going to be a sample of 3 or 4 folks, we're then going to refine that protocol and then test the feasibility of the refined protocol in our actual study. And so as far as kind of, to me, rigor and reproducibility goes, that to me is as close as you can get as like all the steps that you need to hit. Because I remember explaining this to Zach, it was probably a year ago now at this point, and he was like, well, what's your loading paradigm and how are you going to progress them? I was like, I've no idea. I've absolutely no idea how many exercise they can tolerate. I've no idea how to load them. And I think it would be unfaithful for me to actually talk about or hypothesize anything, because I don't know. So we'll see how these community partners tolerate it. And based on that refined protocol, we'll test the feasibility. And if it all works out, if they result in improvements in dyspnea and fatigue and physical function, all the rest, then we'll test it as a comparative efficacy trial. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. I think, and again, like, I think this could have a potentially clinically meaningful benefit. It could turn out in a year from now I was an absolute cowboy and I was wrong and I have to redo all my presentations. You know?
It's super interesting. I think it's a super good point about kind of not just batching the protocol and like making all these rash decisions that you think are going to be, perfect right now, and kind of waiting to see how the efficacy trial kind of works out. And I think that just comes back to the dose point too, right? Because if you were to design like a cluster set program based off what's traditionally done in the literature as far as a training program, but we know those doses aren't actually complete, like you're just running into a bunch of barriers there of like a protocol that just becomes increasingly more unrealistic. And now we test the cluster sets with an unrealistic overall protocol. And then we're like, well, this idea sucks. And it's like, it's not actually the cluster sets, it's just the fact that the overall dose is just way too high because that's never actually been done in a study. So I think that, it's just interesting to kind of see how the thought process of like how much work actually goes into kind of actually finally testing that idea versus like a traditional structure goes into that, because you are starting with all these assumptions, but you have to verify them to make sure that you're actually testing what you ultimately want to know. So yeah, it's super, super interesting. I think, Josh and I have talked about that kind of similar concept in like a trained population. So we saw this reviewed and immediately caught our eyes and thought it was pretty interesting. And I think anecdotally we see, even in like trained people, it seems like it has applications in terms of, you have an amount of work you want to get done, and you're doing that in an organization that essentially the perception of effort is lower per amount of training volume. So I think it makes perfect sense. Now, obviously that's my bias, could totally flip the other way when we actually test it. But yeah, it's super interesting. I find, I thought that was a super cool thing you guys did.
Yeah. Going back.
I think, sorry, Josh, go on.
I'll just go in super quick. I was just going to say it was really cool to see the paper. And then, you're kind of scrolling back and forth between the references and the actual text of the paper. And you're like, oh, these are the papers that, we like to cite sometimes about a lot of these same topics. Going back to our point before, it's like you have the minutia of resistance training. Then you also have like people like yourself who are, applying some of these concepts to different populations. And I just thought it was really cool that, that was a really cool example for myself to see how those two can coexist and of course benefit each other.
Yeah. And it's funny, I think if you look in totality, the the literature that's compared cluster sets to traditional, it's not like it's this, brilliant new form of training. You're going to have all these exponential benefits. And it may very well be that the configuration of a cluster set may be too complicated for untrained folks, much like Zach, we talked about the RIR stuff, who may have different challenges in terms of literacy or cognitive function and all the rest of it. Or it could be that maybe the untrained folks respond differently to trained folks to this, in the sense of, if the outcomes in terms of physical function and all the rest are similar across groups, but the cluster sets allow for better perceptions of effort, fatigue, and dyspnea, that could have important implications for the maintenance
100%.
and adoption of activity.
100%.
So I think, again, it comes back to that kind of the biobehavioral approach, if you want, between psychology and physiology, in understanding what's important to these people in particular,
That's exactly kind of how like we like to frame it, and kind of the more trained population is like, we don't see it as a huge change in like the outcomes you're going to get. Really, it's in reality, our reading of the literature, it's essentially similar results, but the benefit you're getting is that you're getting, like you said, for the same amount of work, you're getting a decreased perception of effort. In our land, that's, potentially you could do additional training volume, a few more sets or something like that. You could maybe increase the load or something like that. But in, this realm, that's going to help a ton in terms of the adoption of exercise, behavior change, all those kind of things. If you can make resistance training suck less, but still be effective, that's going to benefit them both from the adaptation perspective, so they can increase their quality of life, but they're also not going to be dragging ass every time they come into the gym, be like, oh my God, I got to lift weights again. So I think, I just think it's a really, really cool application. I'm really excited to see kind of where your work goes as far as that stuff goes. But I think, we're about at an hour. So we've been chatting for a while here. Ciaran, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your work with us and going back and forth on some of these topics. Where can people kind of get in contact with you if they want to read your work, kind of see what your lab's up to, all that good stuff?
Just chuck my name's fairly consistent across all outlets. If you just put in Ciaran Fairman, Twitter, Instagram, you're not going to see much. I post pictures of my dog every so often. He's a cool dog if you want to see him. I have a website, CiaranFairman.com, and then we have a lab website, exerciseoncology.org, coming out sometime in the next few months that you can keep up. And then if anyone's interested in this space, we're always looking for grad students and research assistants and all the rest. You can email me, Zach, I'll send it to you, and you can link it in the show notes to just chat about any of this stuff.
Unfortunately, Ciaran is an extremely, extremely good mentor, and I cannot highly recommend him enough to help steer your life in a good direction. I've had many chats with him to make sure I'm not going off the dark depths of grad school and stuff. So if anybody needs to reach out to him for advice on that, but also just an excellent mentor and somebody that I can't recommend highly enough, I'll give you your $20 later. But but yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Ciaran.
Yeah, but listen, to both of you, I respect and admire what you both have done. This is a hard game to be in, and I see the work that you're putting in and the quality of work you're putting out. And I just could say that I'm watching with admiration from afar. So I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, thank you so much.
So now you get your $20.
Yeah,
back,
I was just gonna say that's exactly what I was gonna say. I was like, all right, yep, I'll pay you back after the show.
Thank you very much for coming on, Ciaran, and obviously thank you for giving that excellent guest lecture when I was an undergrad, so that we could all be together and chat today. So everybody, go follow Ciaran on Instagram. Check out pictures of his dog. Follow him on Twitter. We'll put that stuff in the show notes. And thanks so much for listening. Take care.